You're listening to the Support Report with Be Present, where we share real stories from young adults and how support changed their lives.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Support Report with Be Present. I am your host, Justin Peters, and it is a privilege for me to be introducing you to the Be Present Foundation and our mission. Here on the podcast, it is our goal to share real stories about young adults and how support has changed their lives. The broader mission of Be Present, it was established in memory of Kirsten Westerman, who we lost after her 7-month battle with leukemia in 2016. And through that, our co-founder and her mother, Abby Westerman, noticed the need for more support around young adults who are battling cancer. So we created the Be Present Foundation with the goal in mind to improve the young adult cancer experience through facilitating more meaningful and consistent support. If you're interested in learning more about our organization and Kirsten's story, I would encourage you to go check us out at be-present.org. And with that, I am excited to introduce you to today's guest, who shares a very similar story to ours. Today's guest is Vivian Nunez, who has had to battle some of her own challenges, and I will let her share with you those. But through that, she saw the need, just like us, to fill a gap. She created and was the founder of, she is the founder of Too Damn Young, which is a community and resource for teens and young adults who are navigating grief. So it is my privilege to introduce to you Vivian Nunez.
Hi, Justin. Hey. Thank you so much for having me on. It's such an honor to spend a couple minutes having a conversation that I think will hopefully help many. Yeah. Your introduction was very sweet. Yeah, I am the founder of Too Damn Young, which is a community and a resource for young adults who have lost someone they love, like you mentioned. And that started in 2016, which feels at this point like a lifetime ago, 2014 actually. And it was inspired by my own personal losses. So I lost my mom when I was 10 years old, and then I lost my grandmother when I was 21 years old. And the gap between losing my mom and my grandmother taught me a lot about grief, and it particularly taught me how much young adults weren't encouraged to grieve and weren't encouraged to hold space for what that time and experience would actually look like if we gave it the time and experience it needed. So with Too Damn Young, it was kind of my act of rebellion. It was my need of how can we make sure that me at 21, a senior in college, has way more than like 2 days to get through this and to figure out how to even live with it, right? Because that's the other reality I'd learned along the way was like, you don't get over grief. You just end up having to find ways to live with it and to get stronger in ways that you can cope with it. And I had a very specific experience with my grandmother where I was her primary caretaker. So I made a lot of end-of-life decisions very early on that I hadn't anticipated that I would have to make as a 20-something-year-old who was like barely legal to drink. And I was deciding, how someone was going to die and when someone was going to die. And the weight of that was much heavier than I think anyone could have anticipated at that point. So it's been very interesting since then to see how the conversations around support for caretakers, how the conversations around grief and mental health as a whole have really shifted and become more inclusive of many, many more experiences.
And man, thanks again for sharing all of that. Like I said, it's a privilege to be involved in this conversation. How did you wind up being the primary caregiver to your grandma? Like, what did your relationship look like prior to that?
So my grandmother was actually my legal guardian after my mom passed away. So I was 10, my grandmother was 75 when she became my legal guardian.
Wow.
And she was very much at home. Like she wasn't really at that point outside doing anything. She was much older. And even though like she could do everything at home from cooking to cleaning, our relationship was one where she was legally my guardian, but the older I got, the more I became her caretaker versus vice versa. I come from a Latino family that predominantly leans on women, and the reality was that the older I was getting, the more I was taking care of my grandmother, the more her children were living their own lives and very consciously aware of like the separation, even just like physically, in terms of they were in their own homes, they were living their own things. So the fact that me and one of my other uncles lived with my grandmother made a difference in who her primary caretakers became. It by default became the people who were living with her. And then by default, even further, the hierarchy of who took on more of the emotional and logistical weight became very clearly it's going to be the person who seems the more emotionally equipped for that and the more logistically equipped to navigate all of that. And it just wasn't at that point going to be anyone else in my family for various different reasons, for their own individual reasons. But I ended up having to take a lot of the brunt of, how do we talk to doctors and doctors very quickly learned that if they needed to talk to someone, they were going to talk to me. Mm-hmm. And so it became this like endless spiral of having conversations and understanding that I was the person to be having these conversations with, and never stopping to think that there should have been a question of why are we having conversations with a 20-year-old about this, and who is supporting her through this process just as much as she is supporting her grandmother. So I think that there was a lot of miscommunication and disconnects on how the healthcare system as a whole filled that gap for me, even if I was, especially because I was filling it for my grandmother.
And maybe to back up a little bit, someone like myself, who my father took care of my grandma her last few years, and really turned into her primary caregiver. So I saw a little bit through that lens. I couldn't imagine at that age. I was probably early into college, 18 or 19, but I couldn't imagine being in that spot, being the primary caregiver to my grandma. And you touched on a few things. What maybe did look like some of the typical daily responsibilities of being a caregiver?
It was definitely, I don't have kids, but that's probably the closest I've gotten so far to having a kid. It was a lot of navigating my own life, right? I was a senior in college by the time that I really became a primary caretaker. I was always her unofficial caretaker, right? Like I went to school in the city, and I went to college in the city to be able to stay close to home and to be home and take care of her. So it was, even from that point, it was going to school, coming back home, hanging out with her. And it was never something that I did, I don't even think consciously sometimes. It just became the structure of my life. And when she actually got sick, it was November of 2013, going into like the end of the winter semester for my senior year. And she started going in and out of ICU. I was interning at the time. I did an internship every single semester, basically, since I was able to get credit for it. And at that time, I was interning at Cosmo, the magazine. And I remember having to tell my editors, like, I can't come in. I have to go to the ICU with my grandmother again. And like, you know what, I'm going to have to cut this internship short because there's just no way that I'm going to be able to finish it. Because so much of the responsibilities revolved around having a very loose schedule that could give into the fact that she would have a seizure at any time, and that would pretty much end normalcy as we knew it at that point, right? Because we would have to rush to the hospital, and there was processes involved with that. And then there were ICU stays, and it kind of just extended out. On a day where she was in the hospital, or after a few stays in the hospital when she really needed care, it was a early morning, making sure her diaper was changed, making sure I like pureed her food the right way so that she could actually eat it, because at that point she was barely passing swallow tests and stuff, so all her food needed to be pureed. And then it was making sure I left for like school at the right time, and that her home attendant, who we thankfully had for a couple hours each day, actually had what they needed for like whatever she needed that day. Making sure that she took her pills. My grandmother would have seizures as a result of infections for the most part, and every time that she would have a seizure and go into ICU, they would sedate her, and then they would have to bring her out of sedation. And the doctors continuously said, like, the more we do this, the more brain cells are going to die, and they're not going to replicate as much because she's just older, and so it's harder for her to come mentally back. And I would see that, but she became very much like a little kid, and so when you would try to give her pills and she didn't want to, she would hide them under her tongue, and she would try to throw them out without you seeing. So you had to like vigilantly watch this person and make sure that they were taking the medication they needed for seizures and stuff. So it became a lot of caretaking. I think that question is really great because I don't think anyone has ever asked me, but it very much felt like watching a kid and making sure that they didn't get into trouble, and making sure they were clean and fed and like in the bed the way that they needed to be so that there weren't cold sores, and making sure that we, were giving her shots in her stomach so she didn't get blood clots and stuff like that.
And I'm curious, how did the outside world respond to the fact that you were a primary caregiver to your grandma? Like I like your peers either at Cosmo or your other internships, or even some of your classmates in college. Whenever I heard one story of you, whenever I think you had to give a class presentation like 30 minutes before, and then you got a call from the hospital and you had to go handle some responsibilities with your grandma. How did the outside world respond to some of that?
I didn't really talk about it. There was no sense of support. There was no sense of like this being a normal thing that people would understand, and that even the intricacies of what it actually meant to be a caretaker wasn't something that if I said I'm my grandmother's caregiver, that they would actually understand what that meant, right? Because we don't talk about the fact that that looks like having to change someone's diaper and putting diaper cream so that they don't get rushes, and like having to figure out how to use like the blue paper, like the blue pea papers, to like turn someone over so that they're not like on their side, or like it's a lot, and like having to navigate blankets so that you can pull them up or down when they can no longer move their body in the same way. So I think I didn't talk about it, and in that moment that you talk about, actually it was probably one of my bigger breaking points in realizing how bad I was taking care of myself, because it was right before like a marketing presentation, and I had to go on, and I got a call from the ICU saying that she was ready to be released, and I was miles away at school about to give this presentation, and I couldn't do it. Like I couldn't leave. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't leave. I couldn't even know where to do. So I literally just sat on the floor and cried. And like I remember calling one of my uncles, and I was like, I can't do this right now. Like I literally have to be in there and doing this, and like I'm getting a phone call because no one else wants to be responsible for her right now, and I just need someone to step up here because it can't be me right now. And I was really fortunate that I'm kind of like in the middle of my grandmother's going in and out of the hospital, I started going to therapy, and she really helped me figure out that what I was carrying was a lot, because no one else made it seem like it was a big deal, right? To everyone else who did know, mostly my family, to them it was like, well, this is obviously the default, so you got to carry it, and like you kind of do with it what you will. And like I just felt like it was breaking me, but no one else seemed to look at me like I was breaking, so I was like, maybe it's just me. But my therapist very much was like, no, this is a lot, and like that really, really helped.
And how did you begin to transition into what you thought? How did you feel like, or notice in that moment you weren't taking care of yourself, and then start to maybe make sure that you're taking care of yourself so that you can take care of your grandma?
I wish I could tell you that I started doing that in a really big way. The only time that I would take care of myself was going into therapy for 45 minutes a week. That was the only time. Up until she passed away, that was very much the only time that I would actually dedicate to myself, because I just didn't have time. Like I was lacking two really important things when you are caretaking for someone else and looking to find a sense of peace. I didn't have time, and I didn't have anyone who was going to give me time. Right? No one else was going to take the load away from me for a little while for me to be able to step away long enough to say she is taken care of so I can go take care of myself. And at that point, you just kind of have to do what you do with what you have. And so it was probably 6 months from November to March when she passed away in 2014. It was probably the hardest time of my entire life, because I was very aware of this person being there, and this person needing me, and this person, will we get woken up in the middle of the night because she is not doing well again. And it became this constant fear of bracing ourselves for like what was next and what was wrong. And like more and more when we went in and out of ICU, we realized that like she just wasn't going to make it. We didn't know when, but we knew it was going to go down the road of having something happen that was going to end up in her passing away. I don't think even in the worst of it, I ever imagined that we would have to decide that. Like that would have to be a conscious decision of like, okay, we should take her off of any kind of added support and like just give her morphine and let this play out. I don't think even in the worst scenarios I considered having to be the one to make the decision. But I think when it comes to just my own self-care, it didn't start until after she passed away, and even then it was survival. It was like having panic attacks outside of stores. It was not knowing what to do with my time because my whole life had revolved around keeping her alive, and she was dead now, and I didn't know what my purpose in life was outside of keeping her safe and healthy. And so I hit rock bottom a lot of times, and I hit like not knowing what I was doing, not knowing how to do it, how to exist in the world, what I wanted, and having to babysit my way into actually figuring out how to be my age. And I'm still working on it. I mean, I'm 27 now, and I am still actively working on how to be 27 because there are many days where my life experiences just don't stack up against a lot of people's life experiences at 27. And so it takes a while to get back to a place where like, oh wait, no, I'm only 27.
Yeah. How did you get yourself out of that stage and, get closer to what resembles a normal 27-year-old?
It was
if that's a fair question.
Yeah. Right. It was a lot of therapy. It was a lot of dedicating that time to like figuring out what I missed and figuring out how to not feel like my life was over because I had lived all these experiences already. Right. Like, how do I go back and just date? Like, I didn't know how to date. I didn't know how to like do very things that a lot of other people have time for when they're 20 something and they're not taking care of someone else. And I found community, right? So like, it's one of the reasons I started Too Damn Young, was trying to find that community of people who understood what grief looked like, and then would make me feel a lot less other as a result of that. And then the hope would then, I think I didn't even realize it then, but like I used my social media a lot to connect with people and write more about what I was actively and actually going through, and more that opened up to my experience as a caretaker and how much that ages you, how much that makes you feel much closer to mortality than I think a lot of other people probably do. But I think for me, it was that. It was also admitting to people, like, I don't want to only be this person who's really good at taking care of people. Like, I want to be the other parts of me that I know I am, like the funny part of me, and like that just like really like sits on the couch part of me. So it was really helpful to have friends who saw that and would not take me that seriously and let me do that, right? Because I think that I ran into the trap a lot, but when people would meet me and I would tell them about my life or what I'm working on or that this had happened in my life or whatever, it would be assumed that I was the mature one and the one that you can come to and like the caregiver. And I wanted to be everything but that. And so it was really nice to have friends and my boyfriend who don't only see me as that and who are able to remind me that they too can carry the weight of things, not just me.
I don't know if this is an appropriate question, but did you ever resent the fact that you were a caregiver and you missed out on so many? I mean, that is from.
I think resentment is like it's not an accurate word, right? Like I think I experienced resentment at the same time in the context of understanding forgiveness. And understanding limitations. I come from an immigrant family. And I think it's probably true for those who even don't come from an immigrant family. But I come from a family, I guess, more aptly equipped to handle smaller crises and to handle things that, the emotional capacity of a lot of the people in my family at that point were how do I not get emotionally invested in this way? And like, how do I not look at the really hard parts of it? And I was really good at looking at the really hard parts of it. And I think that they took that as like, oh, well, she's really good at it, so let's let her do it, and then that'll be fine. I think that the resentment is definitely there. I think it's still there sometimes, and I think it's there in the way of like, oh crap, I didn't do that. I remember gave this speech a few months ago, and like I on stage I said like I didn't have a Taco Bell like meal for like until like last December or last like October or something like that. And my boyfriend asked me like, "Have you ever had these candies?" And I'm like, "No." And he's like, "How?" Like he went to like CVS and bought like a bunch of candies just off their candy rack, and was just like, "Okay, we're trying all of these." Um, I resent it, but I'm also very conscious of the fact that my family did what they could, and sometimes I wish it would have been more because I wish it would have been more so that I wouldn't have had to give as much. But that's wishful thinking based off like the idea of them I have versus who they actually are. And like I love my family; they're really great people. But at that moment, the only person who could like show up for my grandmother was me. And I think I will say this: like I never resented her. I never resented the experience of actually caretaking for her because I think we had a tricky relationship growing up, right? Because she suddenly became my mom, and she was older, and I was a kid who didn't have a mom anymore, and I was very sad and I was resentful about that, and like feeling like I was so different than other kids, and we butted heads a lot, and I held back on a lot of love that I could have given her because it was hard to like learn how to do that, and I didn't have the guidance. There was no mental health support, there was no grief support, so I was really navigating this by myself. And but I will tell you, like those last 4 months with her when she was coming in and out of ICU, there was something that happened when she had those seizures and the way her brain came out of sedation that she was just the funnier like grandma version of her that my cousins always talked about. Then my cousins were like, well, that's the person that they grew up with. They're a little bit older than me. Like my brother grew up with. My brother's 11 years older than me. And I had never met that one because I had always had the one who had just lost her daughter. The one who had lost her husband like decades prior. The one who knew grief and was really hard and harsh about it, and like who was just trying to do right by her daughter's kid. And that looked a lot different. And so those 4 months that were like hilarious and they were funny, and like maybe it was the childish spirit in her that just made her a little bit warmer. And so for that, I will never resent it because I think I in some and maybe in that moment felt like I got the short end of the stick, but in the long run, I say like I got the better end of it. I got more time with her being this human than like anyone else in my family did, and it was like my favorite time with her ever, which is ironic given that it was probably the hardest time of my life.
Mm. Did the way your grandma processed the death of your mom affect you in any way? I'm assuming as a 10-year-old, I'm not even sure you knew how to process what currently happened.
So like this goes back to the culture again. We don't talk about feelings, and we don't talk about people after they've died. Like we go to the cemetery, and the cemetery is never a sad experience either, which is like that's like the one good thing about the culture or like my family, which is when it comes to like talking about grief and death. I remember going to the cemetery from before my mom died, when my grandpa passed away years before I was born. We would go every single Sunday with the entire family, and like there would be an ice cream truck outside the cemetery always waiting, and like we would take our bikes and our scooters, and it was like a family outing to the park. It just happened to be the cemetery. But my grandma, when she lost my mom, when everyone lost my mom was the glue in my family. She's the reason people got together on Sundays, and she's the reason we went out for family outings and stuff. And when she was gone, like we didn't have that person to do that anymore, and we didn't know how to do it to ourselves. And I took a lot of grief cues from the way my family processed their grief, and they didn't talk about it, and they hid, and my grandmother wore black her entire life in mourning of her husband and her daughter. But that was it. That was like your visible cue. You weren't crying about it all the time, and you weren't. And she would cry actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, but she wasn't talking about it. Like she would just cry and be sad. and I didn't have any real mental health support. There was no one there guiding me, and like the fact that this was a 10-year-old losing her parent and her only parent, and what does that actually look like for her in her future. So I had to navigate a lot of the intricacies of that alone, both on like the emotional side, but also just on the logistical side. Like I remember applying to colleges, and you know, you're supposed to put your parents' income or your parents' names and like all this information. And have that. I didn't have my dad around, and my grandma was my legal guardian. And there was no space in like the financial aid packets to put in legal guardian, like particularly not one who's like 80 at that point and makes no income. And so like you're like, I have no idea how I'm supposed to like give this information to you because I don't know how I come out on paper. So I think there was a lot of that no one was equipped for. So it's why when I started Too Damn Young, I wanted to do it both from the like emotional side, but because those are the little things that you don't realize, because a lot of people have the privilege of knowing what to put down on those pieces of paper, you know?
Mm. Yeah. And when did you realize the need for Too Damn Young? Like what was that first moment when you realized I might not be grieving the way that I need to be grieving, and that there needs to be a community or a resource out there to help people that think similar to what I'm thinking right now?
It was maybe like a few weeks after my grandmother passed away that I got the idea for Too Damn Young. I was lonely, and I was upset and angry at the way my professors negated the fact that this was a really heavy experience for me. And that for them, it was like, oh, your grandmother passed away. I'm really sorry, but like you have to get back to class tomorrow. And I'm like, she was my mom. And not only that, I was her caretaker. Like, there's just way more stuff that has to get figured out here. And I'd always been a writer. I'd always liked writing. I've always been a huge fan of social media and like connecting online. And I was like, there just has to be more people than me. I just don't know where they are. Right? There are a lot of statistics out there about how young adults, there are like 1 in 7 Americans who will lose a parent or a sibling before the age of 20. And like, I had gone my whole life without meeting anyone. And so after I started Too Damn Young, I started meeting people, and I was like, oh, okay, like I'm not alone. But it really was that. It was figuring out almost immediately after my grandmother passed away that I was not going to do this the way I'd done it with my mom's stuff. Like I needed to have more space and time for this, and for it not to be like such a not big deal. And that was the inception of like starting Too Damn Young and starting to write more on Instagram about it, about anxiety and depression and grief, and trying to find someone else who also understood.
And what was like the first moment? What was that moment when you first met somebody else that lost someone? You mentioned 1 in 20 people under the age of 20 will lose a parent. What was that moment when you first met somebody that had a similar experience to you?
It was really great. I think it ended up reinforcing this idea that I wrote on the About page of Too Damn Young like years ago, which is just, we all start in the same place, which is simply that we have lost someone. And then where we go from there is unique to us. And I saw that so clearly every time I would meet anyone who had lost someone. And the more comfortable I got to in talking about it in business settings, of like, this is the work that I do, I realized that sometimes you don't even have to have someone say that they have lost someone. Like, you can see it. When I introduce myself and I say this is the work I do, and maybe the person doesn't want to say that they have, but they look at me in the eyes and it's like you just have this sense of acknowledgement that they have gone through it too. And that's enough. You know, like I created Too Damn Young with the hope that it would turn into a community, but not with the expectation, right? And not with the obligation that it needed to be that in order to exist. You know, like hundreds of thousands of people log into the back end and just read it, never say a word. That's great, because maybe you're like me and you're just a really shy like high school student who doesn't want to have to talk to anyone else about it, but who doesn't want to feel alone either. And you have this perfect combination of being able to look online and see these stories, but at the same time not have to out yourself.
Yeah, and there's so much stigma associated around, you know, especially at that age, talking about illness and death and grief. What do you feel like needs to change in the future? And you know, what part do you want Too Damn Young to play in that?
I always say that Tu Young's mission and my mission as a whole is to close the gap on having these conversations around mental health, no matter where you come from and where you start. I think that we can talk about so many layers of how this is taboo and so many ways that this needs to change in order to be a more open conversation. And we also have to acknowledge that there are so many people who just are not starting in the same place, right? Like me losing someone at 10 in a very low income neighborhood, when like a very diverse neighborhood where no one has ever heard about mental health as a thing, it's probably a little bit different than someone in the Midwest who maybe has heard of it, right? Mm-hmm. And like even with Tu Young, I saw how often the demographic was skewing white and girls, right? And young, like teenage white girls. Mm-hmm. And there means that we're not starting in the same exact place as white boys, as any women or young girls of color. We're starting in different places. And so much of it is, how can we make sure that we're reaching the people who are not organically expecting there to be a solution online for them? Right? They're not searching on Google for like, how do I make this feel better? My mom just died. Because they don't have an expectation that there is a solution for that. And they don't have an expectation that there is help and resources for them to cope with something, because there's just no one who's ever told them that there is. Right? And I think that that's the same conversation we should be having with, like, going to and having with boys that are young adults who have lost someone, girls in like low income, diverse neighborhoods who have not been able to be exposed to this. And so I think for me, it's being able to have this conversation openly just as a whole and making sure anyone feels included in it, but then also really acknowledging like that my starting point was much different. And I'm not talking about this because I grew up around it and because I grew up like having someone talk to me about it and understanding the importance. I grew up and I am talking about it because this was the only thing that saved me, was being able to talk about it out loud. And like having someone else that was very outside of my circle reinforce that it was actually something really important for me to be talking about, because it was probably the only way I was going to stay alive, right? Like on the mental health side of it, and like making sure that I wasn't slowly killing myself by not taking care of myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful mission that you have. And for those people who, are going through a similar situation that you were going through, either young adult supporters or maybe even young adults that are battling cancer, what advice would you give around self-care, knowing what you know now and looking back? What would you change, or what advice would you give someone that maybe just walked into this situation?
I actually posted something about this on Instagram yesterday, but it was like a hidden quote instead of a larger conversation. I think that the biggest lesson I've learned over the last few years has been that soldiering on does not make you stronger. It just makes you more exhausted. And soldiering on alone, as a sense, it's just like it's a matter of pride and ego. It's not a matter of actually, like, I could have found help if I wanted it, or if I had help and like knowing that there was other places to look. And it maybe wouldn't have been the people I had wanted to step in, right? My family or like people like that. But maybe it could have been someone in the like healthcare system. Maybe it could have been a doc. There could have been options. But I was also just so up against the wall. So I think it's twofold, right? It's like, you don't have to soldier on by yourself. There probably is a way to help. It's okay if you feel like there is no way to help right now. Because at the very least, I'm realizing like so often, I was just trying to make it to the next day. Like, hindsight is 20/20, in which I wish I would have like not just soldiered on. But in that moment, I was just trying to survive. And there was just no room for trying to do anything else other than that. So I think that is why like the responsibility falls less on the person who is actively navigating it, and more on the people around them, and more on the organizations that can continue to like seek them out and support them, more on like the communities that can exist to support them and find them. Because when you're in it, it's hard, and you don't know how, and you don't know if you have time or how to make time. You're just trying to make it to the end of the day.
And I've heard you speak and give credit to therapy a ton with through your experience, and I love to see that therapy, the stigma around therapy, is really starting to diminish, and I think there's some understanding around it now. But for those people who might be going through something traumatic, and no therapies out there, but feel like there's still a stigma around therapy, can you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. I think that the best way to kind of remove yourself from the stigma is to actually write down what you're like, what about it sounds scary, and what about it sounds like a thing that's going to label you, and what it will label you, and then work back from that. Because the reality is that, like, therapy is honestly just a 45-minute conversation that you sometimes pay for, right? Like, that you're sitting there paying someone to listen to you. And that, at the very, very, like, lowest denominator, is what I define it as. It's just like I'm talking to someone who's very impartial, who still knows the intricacies of my life, but has no, like, actual, like, heat in the game, but, like, can give me really solid advice because they went to school to be able to give me advice. And then everything else that's medical about it and that is diagnosable and, like, stuff like that is stuff that you actually get way more tools to deal with while you are in therapy, right? I think that there's also this misconception that people, the first session you go inside, someone's going to tell you that you have XYZ mental illness and then leave you to your own devices. I didn't get an actual diagnosis, like what I, like, a label for what I was going through for weeks. It took her getting to know me and actually helping me get to a place where I wasn't in survival mode, where I wasn't just trying to, like, make it to the end of the day, for her to feel like, okay, I can, like, say things to her back and, like, I can try here. But I think that it's way more of a friendship building conversation when you start going to therapy than a lot of people anticipate it being. and having that perspective on it actually makes it a little less scary. And then also understanding that you don't have to go at it alone, right? If there is someone else in your life who is going to therapy already, asking them to drive you or to walk with you to the therapy session is helpful. Asking them to be there, maybe if you want them out there afterwards or not, up to you. But, like, just having them be there along the way. I've done it for a lot of friends where I've created Excel spreadsheets of, like, here's, like, the formula you should be looking for when it comes to, like, therapy, right? Where it's, you want to make sure that you don't have more added barriers than you already have in your head, right? So, like, don't pick somewhere really far away from you. Like, make sure it's somewhere by your job or by your school or by your, where you live. In this case, make sure it's someone that you can readily access, not only when we're in self-isolation and, like, you can do it virtual, but also when you are, like, in your life. Making sure they're in their insurance. So if cost is a barrier, it isn't anymore, right? Or that if you have to pay out of pocket, that you talk to them about pay scale and, like, what you can actually feasibly do. A lot of therapists, probably more than a lot of people expect, do pay scale. So it's like, don't add more to, like, the reasons why you wouldn't go if there are reasons you can actually avoid. So, like, making it as easy as possible for yourself is probably the most helpful.
Makes sense. And it sounds like you found a really great therapist. And outside of some of the logistics, is there anything else that you advise people to consider when looking for a therapist?
Yeah, like, for me, I didn't realize, this was not intentional, but looking back at something I definitely advise people of is, my therapist is Latina as well. So she shares a lot of the cultural background. And the only reason that is relevant is because I talk about my family a lot. And it would take up most of the session if I had to explain why their behavior is the way they are. Right? And if I had to justify and, like, say, like, they're not bad people. Like, even in this conversation, when you said, don't you have resentment towards them for, like, not stepping in, she understands that, like, that is just almost how the family is. Like, it's not in my family. It's a lot of the culture. Just, they designate a person, and that is just that. And having someone who I don't have to defend them to, because she understands it's kind of like a part of it, and who helps me cope with the reality of this is just what this is and how they are, is a lot easier than having to do that. So I would just think about your identity, because for me, it was the culture was playing a bigger part of it, right? But for a lot of people, their sexuality or anything else that may come up, just think of your identity, what part of it you don't want to have to constantly explain to someone, and let that be the guiding force of, okay, I need someone who really understands this so I don't have to spend most of my sessions just explaining it.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. And if we can shift gears real quick too,
Mm-hmm.
for people like myself, that the young adults out there that maybe forget how important it is to support young adult caregivers or caregivers in
Mm-hmm.
general. Looking at your experience, what advice do you have for young adults who have the opportunity to support their caregiver friends?
I think showing up is probably the most important part. You don't have to understand the nuances. Like no one ever in my life at that point had to understand the nuances of like what it actually meant to change diapers or what it actually meant to puree food. But actually just being there makes a difference, right? I remember right after my grandmother passed away, I had a friend in college who was just very present through my grief. And it was simple, but like I remember one of the most vivid memories I have was like I was just sitting on the floor at school, just like lost in my thoughts, and he brought me lunch. And he didn't even ask me like, "What did you want?" And he just brought me a Subway sandwich and called it a day. And it was great to not have to think about something for a little while, to not have to like think about how I was gonna get food and what I was gonna like. Oh gosh, here's another thing I have to figure out right now, and I just don't want to have to figure anything out. So being conscious of that, I think, especially, I would say for young adults who have a caregiver in their life who isn't necessarily just a young adult, because sometimes it's so much easier to be there for our peers, but it's so much harder if we're looking at our parents or older people in our lives who are these caregivers. We see them as people who should be able to manage all of this, and we get really upset at them for other things, not realizing how much the stress of being a caregiver is probably impacting XYZ thing. So I think just being really gracious and really forgiving for people and generous with like our grace, that we just the I don't think anyone has actually ever done a huge study on like the emotional impact and stress that a caretaking weighs on people and how that impacts the other parts of their life. So if you have someone that is older or anyone in your life who's a caregiver, just be forgiving, because it's much harder on the day to day, and knowing that someone else's life literally depends on you is just not easy.
Yeah. And that's easier said than done, I think,
Mm-hmm.
to have that patience. And you mentioned presence, and presence is such an important part of our mission here at Be
Mm-hmm.
Present, as well. So thanks for bringing that up. And we're still trying to figure out the best way, how to define presence, the language around that, how to
Mm-hmm.
show up for somebody and know when to show up for somebody. So
Mm-hmm.
Vivian, if somebody resonated with this conversation today, how can they learn more about yourself and the mission of Too Damn Young?
Of course. So you can find me on Instagram. It's probably the most the social media platform I'm actually on the most. So I'm at Viv Nunez on Instagram. And then you can find me at vivnunez.com for all my own personal writing, toodamnyoung.com for Too Damn Young, and that's TOO. And that's kind of where I exist on the internet.
Okay. And with Too Damn Young, people can submit their
Yeah.
story. How does that process work?
So you can actually go to our contribute page right on the Too Damn Young website. That's probably the easiest way to get at us. You can also just email us at write@toodamnyoung.com.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. I would love to just conclude with something a little lighter, on the sense of like, I loved the post of, don't ask me how they died, but ask me how they lived.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to reflect that back, and I would love to just know a little bit about your grandma and how she lived.
That's really sweet. Thank you. You know what? I'll give you a story because it's kind of what we sound tested with today. But I told you I went to get donuts this morning with my boyfriend. I'm based out of New York, so going outside has been a very big struggle lately because as we're recording this, it is like, I don't know, day 40 something of us being in stay at home order. But we went to Dunkin' Donuts and they didn't have a chocolate sprinkled or like a vanilla sprinkled or something. So we had like this rogue moment of like, oh my God, what is the sixth donut we're going to get? And I got a French cruller, and my boyfriend just kind of smiled at me. And the French cruller donut was my grandmother's favorite, and I get it every year for her birthday. I specifically go to Dunkin' Donuts just to get it. So today I was just one of those like, you know what, let's have my grandma's favorite donut, and we split it, and it was really nice. It was a very nice memory of her, and it's been really cool to be able to share those kind of things with my boyfriend, and like also I think a really nice experience to order it, have him hear it, and then not have to explain it because he already knew what it was about. So that was really, really awesome.
Thanks so much for sharing that beautiful story and ending on such a great note. So, Vivian, I appreciate you coming on the support report and sharing a little bit about your story and some of the advice on how we can better support caregivers out there. I encourage everybody to go check out Vivian, as she mentioned. It's Viv Nunez on Instagram, vivnunez.com for a personal blog, and Too Damn Young for Too Damn Young's blog and community and resources out there. And of course, if you want to learn more about Be Present, once again, we are be-present.org. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.